Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Wednesday, August 9th, 2017. The world has two insecure bullies. One in North Korea, one who's at his golf property in New Jersey while they fix the White House. And the bullies are bluffing each other, risking nuclear war. This is not a game. And it's almost laughable on a very black humor basis to see the idiot Donald Trump falling for the threats that come from a punk like Kim Jong-un. And yes, there is a report that North Korea has advanced its capabilities, and the report from Japan is that they think that North Korea is able to assemble an intercontinental ballistic missile with a small nuclear warhead mounted. Now, there are many issues related to whether this weapon would actually work if they successfully launched it. But Trump blew past all of that, and as we reported yesterday as the story was breaking, Trump interrupted a meeting that was at the Bedminster Golf Club that he owns, where he's hanging out for his summer vacation. He was meeting about the opioid crisis and receiving an interim report from the commission that Chris Christie has been heading up. And because there were cameras there, Trump looked at the camera and he delivered just a couple of staccato lines. In commercial production, we would call them wild lines. They weren't germane to the discussion. He just out of nowhere said, "Hey, this guy's been threatening us, and I've decided to threaten back." And using language like fire and fury and power. That's what Trump loves to do. He loves the bluster, he loves the hyperbole, and he likes to talk like he can be tougher than anybody else in the whole wide world. And this is so ridiculous, inflammatory. It escalates the rhetorical war, and as we'll get to in a moment, the bluff was called within a couple of hours by the punk from North Korea. Now, we understand there is a split in the White House staff once again, and what's interesting is that Steve Bannon, the brain of the president, who's considered his chief strategist, well, he is reluctant to really tweak North Korea, but we are told that the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, disagree with Bannon. What we don't know is what provoked the president to issue that statement yesterday, and we're told that he's very proud that he ad-libbed it, and that he didn't discuss the language that he was about to deliver with any of his advisors ahead of time. Now, he may be proud of that, but that is reckless. And the idea that he doesn't need to consult his advisors because he's so frickin' smart, this is a very, very dangerous development. Now, I watched the video several times as Trump delivered this line, and he was intent on delivering a brief soundbite. He did look down at a document on the table several times, but we're told that it contained talking points about the opioid crisis. Maybe he had scrawled down a couple of key words like fire and fury. I don't know. It looked scripted to me, but we're told it wasn't. Now we get to the contradiction that I weighed in on yesterday, that Mike Pence, the vice president, downplays any possible negotiations with North Korea, while Rexon Tillerson, the Secretary of State, continues to offer that as a carrot to North Korea. Then there's Nikki Haley at the United Nations, who's mostly talking about the sanctions. And it is fair to say that the Trump administration scored a victory at the UN to get 15 votes from the Security Council, a unanimous vote in favor of these new sanctions against North Korea. As you know, I'm dubious about sanctions. I don't think they really hurt the people they're intended to hurt, but I do prefer them to any kind of military action. And so as we see this playing out, you have to wonder who had Trump's ear last before he blurted this stuff out. Because that seems to be the way he operates, is that, you can feed him information all day long, but he seems to react to the last person he talked to. Now, what we're told by the New York Times is that Bannon has been arguing against this type of move. He considers the excessively militant approach of the War Party of General McMaster and his allies. But neither camp advocated language like fire and fury, and John Kelly, the new White House chief of staff, is reported to have been taken by surprise. We're also told that the president was in a bellicose mood. So should we get him a mood ring so that we know when it turns red that we shouldn't let him talk to a television camera or get near the nuclear box? And was he in fact suffering from an OxyContin hangover? And that's why he was in a fighting mood. And so this is a dangerous moment. And it's possible that Trump and Tillerson rehearsed this, that Trump is the bad guy and Tillerson is the good cop. And Tillerson argues that, this is the only language that Kim Jong-un understands because, he doesn't respond to diplomatic language very well. And then we got this clown Sebastian Gorka telling Fox News, we are not just the superpower. We were a superpower. We are now a hyperpower. Nobody in the world, especially not North Korea, comes close to challenging our military capabilities. But, dude, Mr. Gorka, get real for a moment. Have you ever heard of asymmetrical warfare? Do you really believe that being a superpower makes us impervious to attacks from other wannabes like North Korea? It's really astounding. And when you see who Trump surrounds himself with, and one just shudders to imagine that Sebastian Gorka was the last person that Trump talked to before he decided to drop these little threat bombs. We also have Trump just bullshitting about his influence over the upgrade and expansion of our nuclear arsenal. He dropped some tweets today saying, hey, one of the first things I did when I got to the White House, in fact, let me read it to you. My first order as president was to renovate and modernize our nuclear arsenal. Actually, his first order was the badly drafted immigration ban. Anyway, let me quote it again. My first order as president was to renovate and modernize our nuclear arsenal. It is now far stronger and more powerful than ever before. Hopefully we'll never have to use this power, but there will never be a time that we are not the most powerful nation in the world. Now, if he truly believed that, he wouldn't have to say it. And the idea that things have changed since he became president is pure and utter bullshit, and nobody knows that better than Kim Jong-un. He can read the Washington Post. He can see that what Trump put in motion was a review of our nuclear capabilities and that any tweaks would not kick in for at least 4 or 5 years. In fact, the upgrades to the nuclear triad that were authorized by the Nobel Peace Prize winning President Barack Obama won't even be completed until well past 2020. It takes years to implement these changes. And so you hear this jingoist talk from Sebastian Gorka. You hear flat-out lies, exaggerations by Donald Trump. And here's the bottom line. This isn't necessary. North Korea knows our nuclear capabilities. They know what we've got parked in South Korea. They know how quickly we could respond to any provocation. And this is Trump's biggest weakness. He's got to brag. He's got to blab. And I have many criticisms of President Obama. But he was very cool in the use of hot power. And Trump is very hot in threatening to use hot power, and it could force his hand. When you get this kind of a confrontation and you ratchet up the tensions, this is when mistakes can be made. And some low-level bureaucrat in Pyongyang decides to move a ship or, move a missile launcher, and we misread that and launch an attack that then leads to a response, and thousands, if not millions, of people are at risk on the Korean Peninsula. As I mentioned, North Korea took just a couple of hours to respond to the threat not to threaten the United States with a threat to the United States about a potential attack on the island of Guam. I believe Guam is a U.S. possession. I know we have military bases there. And it is a rich and reachable target, even for the technology that we believe North Korea had last week. And writing in the in the Washington Post, Henry Farrell notes that brinksmanship is a dangerous game. If you miscalculate your threats or misunderstand the other side's motivations, you might leave the other side with no choice but to respond aggressively. This might lead to a war of mutually assured destruction that neither side wants, but neither side can avoid. And because Trump has no experience in any of this, and because his ego and his pride are more important than the lives of human beings who would be in the path of this conflict, his arrogance prevails and puts us at great risk. And this article continues, if Trump fails to deliver on the threat, then Trump's credibility, such as it is, will be badly damaged, as might the credibility of the United States in future standoffs. Now, what kind of reaction did we see among allies and other observers in Asia? Well, it's kind of mixed. Some people try to stay out of Trump's way, but not the Chinese. A professor at Renmin University of China in Beijing, Cheng Zihao, I'm butchering that last name, but I did my best. Cheng said he is puzzled by the timing of Trump's remark just days after the Security Council imposed the toughest economic penalties yet on North Korea. That unanimous vote, which overcame China's historical reluctance to harshly punish its ally, has been widely described as the Trump administration's greatest diplomatic accomplishment so far. And Cheng said usually the U.S. government is willing to give more time for a resolution to see how the resolutions bite. Other people across the region, some who aren't willing to be named, raised questions about the administration's strategy, about whether Trump recognized the price that some of America's staunchest allies, especially Japan and South Korea, could pay in carrying out this threat. Yes, they are within range of the non-nuclear conventional weapons that North Korea has right now. And here is Lee Byung-chul, senior fellow at Institute for Peace and Cooperation in Seoul, South Korea. Trump doesn't seem to understand what an alliance is, doesn't seem to consider his ally when he says those things. No American president has mentioned a military option so easily, so offhandedly as he has. He unnerves people in South Korea, few of whom want war. And in Sydney, Australia, Yuan Graham says, we're used to painting North Korea as unpredictable, but increasingly it is the U.S. that is introducing strategic unpredictability into a volatile dynamic. And I wish this were strategic. It's just garden variety, vanilla unpredictability because Trump has no self-discipline. And he has no intellectual core. He doesn't have a deep enough understanding of the history of these players and the ugly war that we waged against North Korea in the 1950s. And yesterday was today actually is the 72nd anniversary of the U.S. bombing of Nagasaki with a nuclear weapon. Now, you'll be glad to hear that Trump does have divine blessing to take on and take out Kim Jong-un. This, according to Texas megachurch pastor Robert Jeffress, who was one of Trump's evangelical advisors who preached on the day of the inauguration. And he claims that in the Bible, in Romans chapter 13, that it's very clear. When it comes to how we should deal with evildoers, the Bible in the book of Romans is clear. God has endowed rulers full power to use whatever means necessary, including war, to stop evil. And Jeffress says flatly, in the case of North Korea, God has given Trump authority to take out Kim Jong-un. Now, we make fun of Muslim imams when they issue religious-based orders like this, a fatwa. But here in the United States, we've got respect for a Southern Baptist with a megachurch. After all, a megachurch means he's mega closer to God, right? Well, as I mentioned, that meeting in Bedminster yesterday was about opioid addiction and the crisis in this country. One of the bizarre things I noticed in the footage of the fire and fury threat was Melania Trump was seated next to the Donald. And I don't know what her interest is in the opioid crisis. I know Don likes to bring his family to everything, but gosh, why is she there? What does she have to add to this? Is she secretly a hillbilly heroin junkie? I doubt it, but anyway, she was there. So they also had Tom Price, the Health and Human Services Secretary, who tried to kill Obamacare. And in essence, the Trump team is in general rejecting the recommendations of this commission. First and foremost, the commission recommended that the president declare a national health care emergency, a public health emergency. That has been rejected by Price and Trump. And it's possible that that's a good thing because this declaration of emergency could have unknown and unintended consequences that we might regret. But Trump appears to be unmoved by the recommendations of this commission, and he reverts to the Reagan-era just-say-no policies. He enlightened us with this comment: the best way to prevent addiction and overdose is to prevent people from abusing drugs in the first place. Duh. So if we can keep them from going on, and maybe by talking to youth and telling them, no good, really bad for you in every way. Oh, yeah, Don, that's very effective. He also said that he wants to use strong law enforcement and get tough with China and close our southern border. China is the source of much of the dangerous fentanyl that is coming into the country, and the claim is that a lot of the heroin comes in over the southern border, although I can't personally verify that. And the idea that with millions of addicted people in this country, you can simply cut off the supply and everything's going to be fine is just utterly ridiculous. And one of the key recommendations of the Chris Christie Commission, and I don't have any faith in Chris Christie, but they put forward a recommendation that I fully embrace, and that is to establish nationally and fund a federal program for medication-assisted treatment. This helps people who are hooked on either heroin or opioids wean themselves without going cold turkey. And the most common drug that is used is methadone. But as I reported last week, only 1% of the jails and prisons in this country allow the administration of methadone. And this has got to change. Because the idea that we can just impose abstinence on people and use talk therapy to wean them from this powerful addiction is just crazy. The VA, Medicare's Part D pharmaceutical, none of that covers this MAT, the medical-assisted transition from addiction. And we got to get smart about this because we do have millions of people who are suffering, and we have yet to confront the pharmaceutical companies that foisted this epidemic on the American public and the doctors who wrote all the prescriptions that got these patients hooked on pharmaceutical drugs. It is astounding. And while we're talking about drugs, you may recall the case of Sergeant Robert Bales. He was convicted in 2013 of a killing spree that he conducted in Afghanistan. I think it was back in 2011. And he went out off the base one night and he massacred 16 Afghan civilians. He was convicted, and now on appeal, his lawyers are arguing that the forced dosing of mefloquine, the anti-malarial drug that's also marketed under a brand name Lariam, may have been the cause of the psychological break that led to his killing spree. Now, I don't know if Bale's lawyers will prevail, but I am pleased to see exposure to the use of mefloquine. We know that every prisoner who was brought to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the first thing they got was a dose of mefloquine. There was not a single case of malaria at Guantanamo since they converted it to a prison in early 2002. And we know that the known side effects of mefloquine are hallucinations and other psychoses. Now, what's interesting is that there is a paper trail for Bales, because shortly after the killing spree, it was actually in 2012, a retired Army psychiatrist named Elspeth Cameron Ritchie raised questions as to whether Bales had been taking mefloquine during his deployment. And the following month, the Food and Drug Administration received notification from the drug manufacturer Roche that makes mefloquine that it had received a report from an anonymous pharmacist that a patient taking the medication had developed homicidal behavior that led to the killing of 17 Afghans. 16 was the accurate number. Anyway, I think we need to really pay attention to this, because mefloquine should not be forced on our soldiers, and it certainly should not be criminally injected into prisoners who don't need it. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Jim Garrison, Benny Alto, Terry Paris, and Bill Janetta. I really appreciate your support. And I just will mention to you that for whatever reason, a number of people have recently canceled their subscriptions. They may have found a better podcast. They may be tired of my point of view. But if you find the work that I do important to you, let me ask you to reflect that by making a contribution and taking out a subscription. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, find the menu button, click on it, pull it down, and then click on Become a Subscriber. That takes you to the sign-up page. And I want to give a special shout-out and thank you to Faith Peoples, who was the first to kick in $50 to help me buy a new mixer console here at the Secret Studio. Faith, you're always there for me, and I won't make a play of words on your first name, but thank you. Thank you very much. I also want to mention that I hear from listeners all over the world, and most recently, people have been downloading the podcast in Thailand, in the Netherlands, and also in Denmark. And I often hear from one of our listeners in Denmark who lives on the tiny island of Bornholm. His name is Jens Ivan Nielsen. And Jens sometimes sends me little rhyming couplets or free verse in English. He's quite skilled. And I want to point out, Jens, that today your island was featured in the New York Times in a little travelogue piece called Bornholm, Crafts and Sunshine on the Danish Isle. I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast so people can get a flavor of Bornholm. And it's one of the most exotic locations worldwide where somebody listens to the Peter B. Collins podcast. And frankly, I get a little tickle from that. Kevin Gostola is the guy who he live blogged the Chelsea Manning court-martial at Fort Meade a few years ago. That's how I first connected with him. And he does a great job of covering legal proceedings. And at his website, Shadowproof Today, he's got a story about the case that has been brought against the consultants who worked for the CIA to develop the torture program. If you've listened before, you know they are James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen. And just last week, we were reporting on how their lawyers were asserting Nazi defenses. Oh, they were just following orders. Well, the judge has rejected those arguments, and he has ordered this case to go to trial starting on September 5th. This is the only case we know of where a judge has permitted a lawsuit that could expose more about the torture program to go forward and really take shape. So the judge's name is Quackenbush, and I think Charles maybe is his first name, Justin Quackenbush. And he really excoriated the lawyers for Mitchell and Jessen. He said that their arguments don't really hold water about being ordered by the government to do this, and that their story shifted, and he basically calls out their lies and says that some of the statements are factually inaccurate or incorrect. So this is going to be a very interesting trial, and I hope that Shadowproof will provide the coverage so we can share it with you as it develops starting on the 5th of September. As you know, I am violently opposed to a bill circulating in Congress right now that would criminalize those of us who support boycott, divestment, and sanctions aimed at the State of Israel. And last Saturday in Portland, Oregon, Democratic Senator Ron Wyden thought he was just going to get a lot of Valentines from people grateful that he had been part of the Democratic unity that prevented the destruction of Obamacare. But instead, he was, using his own term, pummeled by members of the crowd who took on Ron Wyden, who fancies himself as a civil libertarian. He also quoted that he is the son of a journalist. But he is trying to make the case, lamely in my view, that the language in this bill only focuses on corporations and on people who support a boycott sponsored by enemy nations or foreign nations. So he makes this bizarre case that any American can express themselves. He says, you got a phone, you can write an op-ed, you can carry a sign, you can protest, you can yourself embrace boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But if the Arab League has a boycott, you can't join the Arab League's boycott. Now, this is really insidious because I can't control the Arab League or any other outside party. I speak for myself when I support boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The other lame argument that he makes is that we had a similar bill that did involve the Arab League that was passed back in the 1970s, and he said nobody has ever gone to jail for defying that law and supporting that boycott. But this new bill provides for fines of up to $1 million, for a prison sentence of up to 20 years. And I find Ron Wyden's arguments unpersuasive. I'm linking to a report on this at Mondoweiss so that you can get more details on how the very strong questioners, members of his town hall, spoke up against the senator. I'm proud of those people. In fact, if you were at the town hall in Portland last weekend, feel free to send me your own report. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com. Also, Senator Elizabeth Warren, the Democrat from Massachusetts, who I have criticized for being Me Too and just adopting the AIPAC foreign policy that is common among the Democratic Party. Well, she announced on Monday that she opposes the controversial Israel Anti-Boycott Act. Now, we don't have a quote from her. We don't have details, but just the fact that she is going public is a good start for Senator Warren. Now, speaking of Israel, I've been mentioning the last few days the investigations into Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We're getting more detail. There are two key cases against the prime minister. Case 1000 has investigators looking at whether Netanyahu offered favors in return for gifts of expensive cigars, pink champagne, and other goods from wealthy friends, including the Israeli Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan. Case 2000 involves backroom dealings with a newspaper magnate, and Netanyahu was recorded negotiating with the publisher of Yedioth Aharonoth for favorable coverage in exchange for curtailing the circulation of a competitor, Israel Hayam. And the tape recordings here could be critical in winning a conviction or shaming Netanyahu into resigning. And the recordings came from his former chief of staff, who has cut a plea deal with the prosecutors. And the New York Times reports that people in Israel are for the first time contemplating what their future will be without Benjamin Netanyahu. Using a search warrant, investigators for the special counsel Robert Mueller recently searched the Northern Virginia home of Trump's former campaign manager Paul Manafort. They were looking for tax documents and foreign banking records, and this shows that the investigation into Manafort has broadened. And this, of course, is based on an anonymous source inside the special counsel's operation at the Justice Department. We're told that the search took place on July 25th, and both sides say that Manafort is cooperating, but this could lead to a deeper investigation, and we'll see where it leads. And finally today, you may have heard about Senator Jeff Flake, the junior senator from Arizona, a conservative Republican. He's been making the rounds promoting a new book called Conscience of a Conservative. He stole the title from Barry Goldwater. And in his own plodding way, he's a guy who is very careful with his words. He doesn't say anything that could go too far. But he does pledge to confront Trump and to tell the truth and to fight for what he considers to be conservative values when Trump doesn't reflect those. Now, this is the first real breach of a Republican saying, I will oppose Trump, at least on a case-by-case basis. Now, we need about another 45 or 50 of those if we ever hope to see Trump removed from office through impeachment or a similar process like the 25th Amendment. I don't know that this is going to make Jeff Flake a presidential candidate or separate him from the the sewage of today's Republican Party, but it's a start. Thanks for listening to my news and comment podcast. We deliver it free every day, and it's available on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling